It sounds like the plot of a dark thriller, but this story is painfully real. At 4:30 p.m. on May 12, 2023, in the quiet town of Maplewood, Ohio, the calm of a late spring afternoon was shattered by a single gut-wrenching scream. That voice belonged to Laura Miller, a young mother returning home from work, usually cheerful, always bringing light into the neighborhood with her warm smile. But on this day, as Laura stepped past the narrow creek behind the house, she suddenly collapsed, trembling violently as she pointed toward the water. In that slow-moving current, where water plants drifted lazily, two small shapes floated side by side. At first glance, neighbors thought they were discarded bags, but as they drew closer, a horrifying truth froze them in place. Floating there were the lifeless bodies of Ethan and Jacob, the beloved sons of Laura and her husband, Robert Miller. Overcome by despair, Laura could only whisper their names before losing consciousness. Neighbors rushed to her aid, frantically calling emergency services. The once peaceful neighborhood erupted into chaos and heartbreak in a matter of seconds. No one could comprehend how such a beautiful, ordinary afternoon could turn so dark. How had both children ended up in the shallow creek, a place that was never considered dangerous? Was it a tragic accident, or was something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface? With that question, Maplewood's sense of safety shattered, and a chilling mystery began to unfold. Within half an hour of the 911 call, police from Columbus, Ohio, arrived on the scene, joined by investigators from the county's major crimes unit. They quickly sealed off the area behind the Miller home, keeping onlookers at a distance. By then, dusk had begun to settle. A fading golden light draped the scene in an eerie glow. The damp breeze carried the scent of wet earth as yellow police tape fluttered in the wind, marking the ground where tragedy struck. Officers moved carefully, lifting the children's bodies from the water and placing them gently on white sheets laid out nearby. Villagers wept openly, and even the most hardened investigators faltered at the sight. But beneath the sorrow, their trained eyes scanned every inch for clues. Almost immediately, they noticed something strange. Neither child showed any signs of violence. No bruises, no scratches, no torn clothing. Nothing that suggested a struggle. That raised the first critical question. Could this have been a simple drowning? But a glance at the creek made investigators doubt it. The water barely reached an adult's waist. A boy Ethan's age would not drown there without a sound. And why would both brothers be in danger at the same time, without anyone hearing them cry for help? Whispers of fear rippled through the crowd. If this wasn't an accident, then something far darker was at play. This was no longer a simple tragedy, it was the beginning of a deeply unsettling investigation. Once the preliminary examination ended, investigators turned their attention to the most crucial step: interviewing the family. Loved ones are often the key to understanding the final moments before a tragedy. Robert and Laura, devastated and barely able to speak, shared fragments of their final memories. Around midday, Ethan and Jacob had been playing in the yard under the watchful eye of their grandmother, Margaret Miller. After that, both parents left for work, never imagining they'd return to a nightmare. Among those most shattered was Margaret herself. The 63-year-old woman clutched her chest and cried out in anguish, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Why did this happen to my grandsons?" she sobbed. "I only stepped out to the garden to pick a few vegetables. When I came back, they were gone. I thought they'd gone to a neighbor's to play." Her desperate cries moved even strangers to tears. Everyone knew Margaret as a loving grandmother, always caring for the boys' meals, always protective. The idea that she could be involved seemed unimaginable. She told investigators that around 3 p.m., she left for the garden and returned 20 minutes later to find the yard empty. Thinking the boys were nearby, she continued cooking until Laura's scream from the creek sent her racing outside. Her explanation sounded reasonable, and her grief seemed genuine. Investigators initially ruled her out as a suspect. Instead, they began exploring whether an outsider might have appeared during that brief window, lured the children away and caused their deaths. But in criminal investigations, even the most logical stories can hide the most dangerous lies. Beneath the surface of this tragedy, darker truths were still waiting to emerge. 2 days later, as grief continued to blanket the Miller family and the entire town, the forensic report arrived, the moment everyone had been dreading. It would determine whether the boys' deaths were a heartbreaking accident or something far more sinister. As the sealed report was opened, investigators immediately knew the case had taken a devastating turn. The autopsy revealed that the children had not drowned. The real cause of death was acute poisoning, specifically, exposure to a deadly chemical used in rat poison. The revelation hit the community like a thunderbolt. The unbearable pain of losing 2 young lives was now compounded by the chilling truth. Someone had poisoned them on purpose. There was no longer any doubt. This was a calculated, deliberate act of murder. And investigators now knew one thing for certain. Ethan and Jacob hadn't simply wandered into danger. Someone had placed death directly into their hands. Who could have been close enough to hand the children something to eat or drink without making them suspicious? Investigators knew the answer pointed in one direction: those closest to them. The deeper they looked, the more convinced they became that the tragedy was not just cruel, but carefully staged to appear as something else. Placing the boys' bodies in the creek behind the house was a calculated move, designed to mislead everyone into believing it was a drowning accident. But the forensic discovery had changed everything. What once looked like an open possibility of a stranger slipping into the home now turned sharply inward. Suspicion shifted toward the very people who should have been the children's guardians. A haunting thought echoed in every investigator's mind. Could the person responsible actually be a family member, someone bound by blood, expected to love and protect Ethan and Jacob above all else? The moment the autopsy confirmed poisoning, the entire direction of the case pivoted. From then on, the focus no longer rested on outsiders, but on those within the Miller household. Only someone the children trusted completely could have slipped poison into their food or drink without raising alarm. Robert Miller, the children's father, was summoned for a second round of questioning. During the first session, Robert had been distraught and incoherent. This time, investigators pressed harder, steering the questions toward the family's private conflicts. At first, Robert avoided their eyes, trying to deflect. But under their relentless persistence, the truth began to spill out. With his head lowered and his voice cracking, he admitted that life in their home was far from the picture of harmony outsiders believed. Tensions between his wife, Laura, and his mother, Margaret Miller, had been simmering for years. Margaret frequently scolded Laura for being careless, wasteful, and for stealing her son's devotion. On the other side, Laura often felt trapped, belittled, judged, and stripped of respect in her own home. Their arguments grew so heated that sometimes neighbors could hear the shouting. But because clashes between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law were seen as common, Robert never believed it would go beyond words. With tears rolling down his face, Robert whispered, "I thought even a wild animal wouldn't harm its young. I never imagined a grandmother could hurt her own grandchildren. Despite their fights, I still trusted her to watch them. My blindness cost my boys their lives." His confession not only laid bare the family turmoil but also exposed a potential motive investigators could no longer ignore. If Margaret's resentment toward Laura had reached a breaking point, could she have directed her rage at the boys, 2 innocent children carrying the bloodline of the woman she despised? The puzzle pieces began falling into place, and suspicion started circling the grandmother. Still, accusing a grandmother of murdering her grandchildren was an extraordinary claim. It required more than motive or strained relationships. Investigators needed evidence that no one could dispute. Robert's testimony revealed the history of bitterness, but suspicion alone would never be enough to prove guilt. To accuse Margaret Miller of such an unspeakable act, investigators needed undeniable proof. Their attention shifted to a vital lead: security camera footage. If Margaret had committed the crime, then surely somewhere, a camera might have caught a clue that contradicted her story. But Maplewood, being a quiet town, offered few cameras at all. Officers had to knock on door after door, explaining the case and asking residents for access to their recordings. Some agreed without hesitation, while others resisted, needing reassurance before cooperating. After days of persistence, investigators collected hours of footage from different homes. Some cameras only caught chickens roaming in yards, others were grainy or frozen in place. Still, the team refused to give up. A special task force was assembled to study the recordings frame by frame, searching for even the faintest inconsistency in Margaret's account of going to the garden for vegetables. Investigators worked tirelessly, eyes locked on screens, carefully documenting each time stamp. Many stayed awake through the night, aware that a single overlooked frame could keep the truth buried forever. The atmosphere in the room grew suffocating, the steady click of a mouse breaking the silence, followed by groans of disappointment each time another clip revealed nothing new. Still, the team refused to give up. They believed the truth could not remain hidden forever from such determined eyes. And then, buried within endless hours of seemingly ordinary footage, the breakthrough appeared, a single moment that would turn the entire case upside down. Detectives had spent days combing through dozens of hours of recordings, refusing to skip even a second. At times, hope seemed lost. Most cameras captured nothing more than daily routines: Children laughing, neighbors heading to the local grocery store, or flocks of chickens darting across dusty yards. But persistence finally paid off. A camera mounted on an abandoned storage shed, a few hundred meters from the Miller home, captured the most crucial detail. The image was grainy, the angle poor, yet detectives recognized the figure instantly. At around 3 p.m. on the day of the tragedy, the video clearly showed Margaret Miller leading Ethan and Jacob by the hand toward a secluded section of the creek at the end of the lane. Slowly, the three figures disappeared behind a stand of trees. But when the camera caught her again 20 minutes later, Margaret was walking back alone, calm, collected, and carrying a sun hat. There was no trace of panic, no frantic searching for two missing boys. This stood in stark contrast to the story she had given earlier, claiming she had only gone to the garden to pick vegetables and had never taken the children anywhere. The footage exposed her deception. The investigation room grew heavy with silence as the video replayed again and again. Everyone knew the camera didn't lie. This was undeniable proof, the crack in the mask she had worn so convincingly before her neighbors. From that instant, the investigation shifted completely. The grieving grandmother the village had pitied was now at the center of suspicion. The truth was surfacing, and the legal net was tightening swiftly around Margaret Miller. Armed with the footage, investigators prepared for a final, decisive interrogation. The third session with Margaret took place in a stark, quiet room. She entered with the same practiced sorrow, eyes red, clutching a handkerchief, protesting that the accusations were cruel and unfounded. She insisted she loved her grandsons too deeply to ever harm them. The lead detective listened without interruption. When she finished, he calmly opened a laptop and pressed play. On the screen, there she was, walking hand in hand with Ethan and Jacob toward the creek, then returning alone, serene and composed. In that moment, Margaret's expression shifted. Her mask of grief vanished. Her lips trembled. Her hands fidgeted in her lap. The room was still, save for the hum of a ceiling fan. The detective leaned forward, his voice steady but commanding. "Do you have anything to explain?" Margaret lowered her gaze, stammered a few hollow words, but her voice faltered. Faced with undeniable evidence, the charade collapsed. Finally, she exhaled heavily, her body trembling as she admitted the truth. Years of conflict with her daughter-in-law, Laura, had twisted her heart. Her resentment grew so poisonous it smothered the natural love a grandmother should hold for her grandchildren. In that darkness, she devised a plan for the cruelest revenge imaginable. That morning, she went to the local grocery store and purchased rat poison, claiming it was for vermin in the kitchen. Later that afternoon, she mixed the poison into a glass of soda and offered it to Ethan and Jacob with sweet words. When the boys began to convulse and collapse, she carried them one by one to the creek behind the house, lowering their limp bodies into the water to disguise their deaths as a drowning accident. Returning home, she put on the mask of a grieving grandmother, weeping in front of neighbors and police, pretending to be broken-hearted. But now, with her cold confession laid bare, even hardened detectives were shaken. How could hatred for a daughter-in-law drive a grandmother to commit such inhuman cruelty against her own blood? The bitter truth had finally been revealed. The woman once mourned as a victim was unmasked as the true culprit. Her confession ended the charade that had gripped the town for days. With her words recorded, investigators prepared the next step, a crime scene reenactment to confirm every detail of her testimony. At dawn, near the creek behind the Miller home, hundreds of townspeople gathered in stunned silence. Everyone wanted to see with their own eyes how the woman they had pitied just days before could carry out such an atrocity. Margaret was brought forward, head bowed, hands quivering, and made to repeat each step, stirring poison into soda, coaxing the children to drink, lifting their weakened bodies, and finally lowering them into the murky water with chilling calm. The scene was unbearable, the atmosphere so tense it felt suffocating. For many, it was the cruelest betrayal imaginable, a grandmother turning against her own grandchildren. And in that moment, the entire village realized that evil had been living quietly among them, hidden behind the mask of family love. When the crime was finally reconstructed, the people of Maplewood could no longer contain their emotions. Many wept openly, while others cried out in disbelief, struggling to accept that the sacred bond between a grandmother and her grandchildren had been poisoned by hatred so deep it turned into cruelty. Some villagers shook their heads in despair, whispering, "How could blood betray blood in such a way?" Robert and Laura Miller, the grieving parents, stood apart from the crowd. Their eyes were swollen from endless tears, their bodies trembling as they watched the scene unfold before them. To them, this wasn't just an investigation being laid bare, it was a knife twisting deeper into their wounds. Overcome with grief, They collapsed into each other's arms, their broken cries echoing through the silence, drawing tears from even the coldest onlookers. The sight of Margaret Miller calmly retracing her horrific actions ignited a storm of outrage across the nation. Newspapers carried the story on every front page, while social media overflowed with fury. Thousands of voices questioned how, in this day and age, a grandmother could become a murderer, stealing the lives of the very children who trusted her most. What had once been a tragedy confined to one family now gripped the entire country, leaving people uneasy and haunted. The case forced a chilling question into the open. If conflicts inside a family are allowed to fester, how destructive can they become? On the morning of Margaret Miller's trial, heavy rain swept across Maplewood. The downpour mirrored the grief of a community draped in sorrow. Villagers gathered outside the courthouse, not simply out of curiosity, but with a solemn need to witness justice with their own eyes. For months, the case had consumed conversations in living rooms, workplaces, and town halls, stirring painful reflections on loyalty, morality, and the fragility of family ties. Inside the courtroom, Margaret sat hunched, her face lined with age, but her eyes revealed neither remorse nor warmth. Across from her sat Robert and Laura. Their bodies looked frail, their faces hollowed by sleepless nights and endless grief. They weren't there just to demand justice. They were there to confront the unbearable truth. The person who destroyed their family was Robert's own mother. The prosecutor began reading the indictment. Each word struck like a hammer, echoing through the courtroom, cutting into every heart that listened. Margaret Miller's crime was declared deliberate murder of the gravest kind. She had not only ended the lives of her innocent grandsons Ethan and Jacob, but had staged the scene to appear as an accident, hoping to deceive investigators. The cold precision of her deception left no doubt. She had understood exactly what she was doing. Her defense attorney offered only a plea for mercy, citing her advanced age, fragile health, and eventual confession during questioning. But no argument could erase the rage of the public, nor could it soothe the endless agony of the Miller family. When the jury retired to deliberate, the room fell into a suffocating silence. Every eye turned toward the bench as the judge returned, voice heavy with finality. Given the defendant's actions, marked by cruelty beyond measure, leaving devastation for the victim's family, and sending shockwaves through society, the court sentenced Margaret Miller to the ultimate penalty, death. The words landed like thunder, bringing closure to months of torment. At that moment, sobs broke through the courtroom. Robert and Laura clung to each other, tears pouring freely. It was justice served, yet it brought no peace, only the brutal reminder that no sentence could return their children. The ruling was not just a punishment for Margaret Miller, but also a dire warning to society. Unresolved hatred within a family can grow into a darkness capable of unthinkable violence. A person once gentle can be consumed by bitterness until they become unrecognizable, even to those who loved them. This case forces reflection. How many other families are quietly weighed down by grudges, between in-laws, siblings, or parents and children? Words spoken in anger, grievances left unresolved. These can harden into rifts that, if ignored, may one day erupt into disaster. Above all, this tragedy reminds us of our responsibility to shield children. They are innocent, untainted souls who must never become collateral damage in adult battles. No matter how fierce the conflict, it should never be turned against them. The trial ended, the verdict was read, but Ethan and Jacob will never return. Their parents will live forever with scars that time cannot erase, and society will continue to wrestle with one unbearable question. How could a grandmother extinguish the lives of her own grandchildren, driven by nothing more than resentment toward her daughter-in-law? This story leaves behind a devastating lesson. It teaches us the importance of forgiveness, the need to cherish family ties, and the thin, fragile line that separates love from cruelty. When affection gives way to hatred, the destruction doesn't end with one family, it ripples outward, shaking an entire community. Justice can punish, but no justice can ever heal the void left by such loss. The only true safeguard against these horrors lies in compassion, understanding, and the daily choice to nurture love within our homes. That is the only way to ensure such darkness never finds a foothold again. What are your thoughts on this heartbreaking case? Share your reflections in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so we can continue uncovering the hidden truths that lurk behind the quiet surface of everyday life. This tragedy reminds us of a truth we often overlook. Family, though bound by blood, is also fragile. Love can build it, but resentment can destroy it. The Miller family's loss is a warning etched in sorrow. a reminder that silence in the face of conflict can be more dangerous than confrontation. No matter how deep the disagreements, no bitterness should ever outweigh the value of a child's life. Ethan and Jacob were innocent, carrying no part in the disputes of adults, yet they became the ultimate victims of hatred left unchecked. Their story is now part of a painful lesson for us all. If compassion, forgiveness, and patience are not nurtured within families, even the closest bonds can be shattered. Let us carry forward the memory of these two young boys, not in despair, but as a call to strengthen love in our own homes. Let their loss remind us to hold our children closer, to resolve conflicts before they consume us, and to never allow anger to eclipse love. Because in the end, true justice is not only served in courtrooms, it lives in the way we choose to protect, forgive, and cherish one another before tragedy has the chance to strike. Thank you for watching this story. If it moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so together we can continue uncovering the hidden lessons behind the stories that shape our lives.